Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
This week, we've seen Canadians flock to Hudson's Bay stores across the country as the iconic Canadian department store stares down what could be its last gasp. Maybe it's to score everything must go items, or maybe it's to snag something, anything, adorned with the iconic and unmistakably Canadian red, yellow, green, indigo, and white Hudson's Bay stripes. Look, either way, Canada's oldest company, which marks its 355th birthday this May, has begun its liquidation process on 74 countrywide stores this week after seeking creditor protection for more than $1.3 billion in debt. 6 locations, 3 in the GTA and 3 in Quebec, will remain open for now as the company looks to restructure itself to keep the lights on. Will they be able to find a way to save the stripes, or is this all heading toward an inevitable and familiar end for another former retail giant? I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia, and with me on The Big Story is retail expert Gary Newbury. Gary, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Gurdeep. How are you doing?
Really good. Yeah, lots to talk about here, Gary, so let's dive right in.
Okay.
I mean, to say the Bay is an icon of Canadian retail and commerce history is probably an understatement. So to see the end of an era, it's objectively sad for people who grew up in this country. Broadly speaking, what do you make of the recent court ruling to liquidate?
Yes, I think it's always been inevitable over the last few years, and particularly with the acquisition of Neiman Marcus, and then Saks and Neiman Marcus being sort of hived off into a separate organization, leaving HBC on its own. That was a very strong signal, certainly for me, that something's afoot. And it became much more apparent, obviously, during March that the plan was to just deal with it and get shot of the retail concept and realize as much value from the leases and freeholds that they owned across. I think they had something like 40 million square feet of property, to see how much of that could be churned into some money to pay off all the debt that had been accumulated by the retail business.
And Gary, look, we're seeing it this week, but obviously the Bay is a beloved company here in Canada, but the reality of the 2025 retail landscape, it doesn't necessarily favor the old brick and mortar department store. And we've seen this story play out many times with Sears, Nordstrom, Zellers, Simpsons, if you want to go back even further. Does the Bay closing most of its stores come as a surprise to you, or do you think this was really only a matter of time?
Yeah, it was only a matter of time. But I have to say that the retail economy within Canada does go up and down, and new entrants come in, they disturb the natural flow of things, and other entrants like Nordstrom, as you mentioned, sort of disappear. But there's plenty of work to spread around. But the most important thing with retailing, you actually have to be good at it.
Right. And what do you mean by that?
Well, you have to have products that customers want. You need to understand what your target segment is and be very clear of how you're going to address that. And I think that HBC, certainly in the time I've been here in Canada, which was 2012, so I've been here 13 years, has always been like an insipid mall anchor. And I hardly went in there because it wasn't very enticing. And when I did go in there, the assortment of product was pretty dire. The look and feel of, when you touch the material, it's really cheap and nasty sometimes. And the price point was like astronomically out of line with going to an alternative apparel store.
Okay, yeah, let's pull out that thread, to use a pun, I guess, on that one. So in terms of contributing to the downfall of retail businesses at large, and you're talking about the Bay, but if we zoom out a little and sort of take the 30,000-foot view here, what do you think it is? Is it not adapting to change, not sort of responding to consumer trends and behaviors, or maybe responding too much to competitor behavior, losing your own identity, or in the case that you just sort of mentioned, maybe just the quality of the products not being what it used to be?
Yeah, I think that if we not only zoom up, but also zoom across time. If we think about what's happened since the acquisition by NRDC of the HBC group of organisations, let's just talk about the stores at the moment. They had, at the time when Richard Baker, through NRDC, acquired it in 2008, Bonnie Brooks joined, and now she was a very established retailer. But she was she was there for about 8 years, and she would have been given a brief to tidy up what we had, but don't necessarily have the investment to actually do something with the brand, because the owner, Richard Baker, really only saw it from a leasehold and real estate kind of dimension. So there was no point in having a massive change in the store experience, because that wouldn't necessarily relate to an improvement in the real estate valuation. And then she moved on, and Gerald Storch was brought in, and they brought in Helena Fawkes, a very strong retailer, very sort of into the cost side of things. She was brought in 2018 to actually get rid of that, sort out Home Outfitters, sort out the stores, try and reduce the cost base of the retailing operation, and therefore not really think about what is our target segment we're going for. How do we address that? What marketing materials, and how do we present ourselves to that type of segment? Her focus was reducing or containing the damage that perhaps the previous two people had done. And then she left, and then Richard brought in Ian Narn, and there was a kind of a IP challenge around Zellers, because many listeners might remember that Zellers was sold to Target. Target didn't do too well here, and so they had to sort of release all that property back into the retail community. And then he left in early 23, and they brought in Sophia Hwang Judish to kind of run that forward, and her job was to, it looked like to run this across the whole network and try and introduce it into the right markets that Zellers would have some interest in. And some of it was good. And then she moved on. And then I think Richard reached out to a previous lady who ran Lord and Taylor, which was part of the enhanced HBC group before it was sold off. Brought her back in to basically close shop, I think. And I think that this was absolutely inevitable. This would happen. This was a business where the retail element of the proposition was just seriously overlooked for a long, long time. So you can only run a business for so long when you don't really pay attention to the product, the market you're trying to get into, the customer experience. So there's a whole range, in my mind, there's a whole litany of strategic moves which failed miserably.
Good history lesson there. And when we're talking about the demise of HBC, we can't do it without talking about online shopping. Look, I mean, people already liked online shopping, then the pandemic comes along and it really seemed to sort of accelerate the volume and speed of online shopping. First, out of necessity, because we couldn't go into physical stores, and perhaps now out of sheer convenience. How do you think the pandemic really changed the way we shopped? And do you ever think there'll be sort of a pendulum effect where people will want to get back into the old habit of in-person shopping? I don't know if this is too far of a bridge, but maybe in the same way vinyl and retro arcades have come back.
Yeah, I think what happened during the pandemic, people were sat at home, often getting government checks. They were looking around their home and saying, "Oh, we need to change that, So we're looking for ways of using that time, using that money to improve their home. And so the e-commerce, there were two factors in play. Firstly, to the point you just made, the sales through stores went to basically zero for everything but essential retailers like grocers and pharmacies, etc. So your store level your store level sales went to zero. So everything had to be traded through a combination of click and collect. So you come to the store front and somebody runs out with their order, or home delivery. So during that stage, it was a trick of mathematics. The e-commerce volume went up to about 15% of total sales, and then it quickly fell back down, because when people got free of the restrictions, they didn't carry on shopping on Amazon and shopping on HBC.ca. They actually went to the stores. They missed the stores, because stores are about a sense of belonging, community, being around other people, and being okay about it, and shopping as a team sport effectively. And I think that the if we think about the e-commerce before the pandemic rate was about 2.5 to 3% of total sales, I think that's about 5, maybe 6%. So some people said, well, do you know what? I'm not going to get my groceries. I'm not going to go to all the thing of getting my groceries, going to the store. They keep moving shelves around, so I don't know where I am. I'll just order that online, like, Sobeys with Voila or Lovelaw's, Walmart, etc. And I'll either go and pick it up from a store or just get it home delivered. So there's some residual change in behaviour, but fundamentally, people have rushed back to stores. They like certainly in apparel and things like the products that HBC sold, they want to go and touch it and kick it and feel it. Will it fit in, and what's the dimensions of it? They want to actually go and touch product and then buy it. While they're there, might as well buy it.
Yeah, certain retail is tactile, right? You want to feel it. You want to try it on. Now, Gary, besides evolving retail habits, which we've touched on here, the Bay, which we mentioned is Canada's oldest company, it does have, as such, a complicated and lengthy history with Indigenous communities, including, conflict over fur trade, not respecting Indigenous governance and autonomy, as well as the ways in which their Indigenous communities were excluded from the expansion and evolution of HBC over time. Do you think this dark history played any factor in the company's demise? And if so, how so?
Well, I'm not an expert in the history, but I was just doing some digging myself. And this company has been subject to a lot of change over a long period of time. So we can chunk time up into the first 200 years, and it was to some of those points that you just raised. There was a lot of change in the early days. It was French, then it was British, then it was parts of land were handed over to the Canada. They had something at one stage. They had something like 40% of the surface area of Canada was owned by, I think it was called Rupert Land, owned by the thing that became Hudson Bay. During that time, the next sort of 100 years, they did more fur trade, but they also got involved in oil. I mean, when I was reading this, it's like, how did that happen? And they didn't establish their first store until 1857. So they've been trading for 200 years before the actual a department store, or at least a store, emerged, and that became the format for future trade. But the fur trade, I think through HBC, actually finished quite recently. I think it was 2012, if I've read it correctly. So that was quite interesting. As I was reading and sort of digging into it, I thought that fur trade would have been like one of the first things to have stopped, but maybe in the 80s, say. But it was actually still quite recent when it was actually stopped. But nonetheless, as I sort of reflected earlier, that even since 2006 and 2008, when the NRDC acquired it, it's still that whole group, including Saks, Lord and Taylor, obviously HBC and other brands, all went through various stages of change. So I think that when we think about HBC as a nice, long, traditional retailer, actually, it's only been a relatively recent apparition. And even then, it had a lot of changes in its history up to that point, and it continued that path of changing frequently. They're acquiring companies and rebranding those companies. Sometimes they got acquired and they rebrand, like Morgan's, which is not a company obviously I'm familiar with. Simpsons, they got involved with that and changed those over to HBC format organized stores. So. And then that recent history since the acquisition with Bonnie Brooks all the way through to the current CEO, Elizabeth Rodbell, even in that relatively short period of time in its whole history, it had a fundamental shift in strategy 4 or 5 different times. So that organization, and the important point I'd make is, it would be great if all that strategic change was driven by the marketplace rather than driven by maybe Richard Baker and his pursuit of trying to realize the maximum valuation for his real estate portfolio.
Gary, this is all happening at a very fascinating intersection of time. The demise of Canada's oldest company, with the current push to buy local and buy Canadian amid, annexation and tariff threats from U.S. President Trump. Do you think the Bay could potentially capitalize on some of this galvanization of Canadians, the momentum to possibly achieve salvation of HBC, or is this just, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic?
Well, the interesting thing, I went into my local store in OC on Saturday, and I've never seen it so brimming with people. Not everybody had something in their hand they're looking to buy, but they were in there, and I think everybody knew the sale didn't start till Monday, so they're in there scaffolding things around. Even I went to see if I could find some of that those towels, because I'm determined to get one before they really close. But I think that my personal view on this is that I think the stores will close. And the six, there's some doubt about would they survive or close. I think they would naturally close, and Richard Baker will probably find ways of using them, trying to get the maximum real estate value out of that to pay off all the huge debt that has been racked up on the retailing side. I think the brand has definite IP, especially at this time with this sort of Buy Canada and Find the Leaf kind of campaigns that have been raging across Canada. I think it would be a great opportunity if one of our Canadian entrepreneurs, like whether that's Doug Putman or Jim Minram, would take that IP in that product, in that brand, and put it into somehow organize it into their network of stores. I think my view on that is probably it'd be better for Putman Investments, because they've got Toys R Us. They've got large cavernous stores, and of course HBC was much bigger than Toys R Us in terms of like the space that was available to her. But we are talking about the kind of Canadiana. Is it Canadiana?
Canadiana. Yep.
I think it Canadiana. That has definite value, and it's whether or not some of our current entrepreneurs or somebody else takes that and does something with it. That has value, because it has that kind of, more so than Zeller's, because I think Zeller's was a definite nostalgia play, which just kind of dissipated because it was, I would say it was poorly executed. But imagine that you have those towels and all the other stuff around HBC, but people associate HBC and the history of HBC together. That could go as a great store-in-store operation, especially if it's well executed. And given the situation we find ourselves in with those campaigns, I think this has real value.
And important to note that the Bay has seen a boost in sales since announcing plans to seek creditor protection. It has paid off some of its debtor in possession financing. And the 6 stores that are going to remain, the 3 in Ontario and the 3 in Quebec, they have to come up with a restructuring plan by April 4th, which is next Friday. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that story as it evolves and plays out. But one last one for you here, Gary, before we let you go. What advice would you have for other big name franchises that are, watching this from the sidelines, seeing what's going on with the Bay, and are obviously looking to avoid a similar fate, if avoidable at all?
I think it's really a question of sticking to the knitting. Really understand your customer. What are their expectations? Have we got the right products in place to interest them into the store or onto the website? How are we delivering the customer experience? These are like the basics of like retailing 101. The HBC executed very badly. But I think when we think about, other kind of more departmental, mass merchant stores like Canadian Tire and, that's people like that, I think they've got a fairly clear picture of what their customer base is. And, I would argue that, their own format is a rather stale concept, but it seems to work. And they're making tweaks around the edges, but not disturbing the center ground of why they appeal to Canadians, coast to coast to coast. Whereas HBC really, it was this idea that it's been around for like 350 plus years. And of course, it's a Canadian company. Of course, we should go and shop there. But when people went into shopping, including me, particularly me, it was like, this is really bad. This is not being executed well. I remember going in there just before the pandemic. I went into the men's accessory department for a change. I've never been in there before. And it was like a tsunami. Everything was on the floor. It was disheveled and everything. And I actually went to find somebody to ask, is this a new brand in image you're sort of running? And I couldn't find anybody.
Oh,
there
dear.
was no staff. So how are you expecting to sell to people who just want this extra level of customer experience, extra level of product knowledge, store associates. They worked this concept on the basis of reducing the cost of running a store without understanding that the way to long-term profitability is to make sure you know your target segment, you've got the right type of product in there, right marketing, and importantly, the right levels of service or customer experience.
Sounds a lot like my high school bedroom. Clothes everywhere and just me.
And mine.
Gary, thanks so much for doing this. That is retail expert Gary Newbury. You can follow Gary on LinkedIn. And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode and any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can always leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app, that's SEEKR, or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia. Thanks for listening.